To go back to some of the regulations, GDPR, California has CCPA. There's been talk for quite a while about Google eventually deprecating third-party cookies. Apple and Microsoft have made some strides there already. Do you think that these things are going to have a meaningful impact or enough of an impact on some of these things, or is there a lot else needed here?
So I think the good thing about some of the regulations and some of the changes that are being made is it does create visibility about the
Yeah,
issue, and it helps create like a forcing function for companies to care, which is good. Like, I think
yeah,
we've seen from GDPR and from some of the other regulations that now have come up, like there's over 100 different privacy regulations around the world now. It has made this more of a priority for companies, which is a good thing.
yeah.
And the headlines around fines and stuff also becomes a certain forcing function for people to do something. But I think when it comes to compliance, like compliance is really like a baseline. Like tons of companies that are technically compliant still have data breaches.
Yeah.
So just because you're compliant to HIPAA or PCI or some other type of regulation doesn't necessarily mean that you still have best in class security. It's kind of like you've checked off some level
Right.
of privacy and security, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have the best in the world. So I think one of the big things that I would love to see us do as an industry is have more education when it comes to engineering talent around privacy and security. Like I mentioned at the start of the show, I spent a decade in university, but my only security, I had zero privacy training whatsoever through 10 years of schooling. And the only security training I really had was like one undergrad course in encryption. So I think it's very important that every engineer that is building a lot of these systems has some base level understanding of what good means when it comes to privacy and security and why this is important, and a basic understanding of data protection methods, and understand that encryption isn't always enough, and that there's differences between tokenization and encryption, and why you shouldn't make 10,000 copies of someone's social security number, and that there's
Right.
existing technology out there that can help solve these problems. But there's just a lack of education when it comes to a lot of the complexities around this. And I think what ends up happening, because we don't have the education and the understanding, is people think that they can really just like DIY solutions to this, and they don't realize how complicated it gets and how hard it is to actually solve.
Yeah. So how then the organizations that are doing it well, what is it, a philosophical thing? Is it an overall approach? Like how are those brands that are doing this well thinking about data privacy in the current landscape?
So I think there's a couple of things. One is that it's a big part of the culture of the company. So I think there's historically, for companies that have created as privacy functions, if you don't do it as really part of the cultural identity of the company and make it everybody's responsibility to prioritize privacy and security and work with the privacy function and understand the value there, then it could create friction within the company where those functions feel like the office of no, and they stop you from being able to do your job. So
Right.
you don't want that. So I think that's like one of the fundamental issues that you need to address. And then the other thing is that when it comes to sort of the technology that's involved, if you look at some of the top companies in the world that have done a good job in terms of from like a security perspective of actually protecting data, companies like Apple, Netflix, Goldman Sachs, and so forth, they took a real first principles approach to how they address this problem. And they pioneered a technology known as the Zero Trust PII Data Privacy Vault. And it goes back to what I was talking about earlier, where they recognize that PII or customer data is something special and it needs to be treated differently. And it has to have essentially specialized technology developed for the secure handling of it and secure use of that information. So they created these vault architectures where they moved their customer data into those vaults that gave them isolation, protection, and governance over the data, and it effectively like de-scoped or de-risked the rest of their systems from actually handling any of the raw
Mm.
sensitive data. So you're creating essentially an isolated infrastructure to store your customer data, creating a single source of truth that's outside of your existing systems. And this helps stop a lot of the data sprawl problems that I was mentioning. And
Yeah.
also it becomes a lot simpler to essentially govern access to data, because you have essentially this like protected environment that is dedicated to storing the data and actually the use of the data, rather than having it sort of intermixed with everything else. It's the same idea of, putting your diamonds in a safe in your home or in some sort of vault versus having them in your refrigerator with your cheese.